Hey everyone, welcome to another deep dive. This time, we're going to be taking a look at Intel and their position in the semiconductor industry. And this is something that you requested. You also sent over some fascinating material from Peter Zeihan to get us started. So, uh, yeah, really excited to kind of dig into all this. What I've been seeing is that this goes way beyond just like one company.
Mhm.
It's really about global power dynamics and like the future of technology.
Yeah, absolutely. We use semiconductors every single day, but we don't really think about them that much. But they're in everything. And it's not just about like who's making them right now. You really have to look at the big picture here. You know,
Mhm.
all the different stages, all the different players involved, especially now with all the geopolitical stuff happening too. It's really important to understand this stuff.
Okay, so before we get to Intel, let's zoom out a little bit. You sent me some research showing just how complex this industry is. Can you give me the big picture here?
Well, the semiconductor industry starts with design, which is incredibly complex. It's kind of like imagine planning a city, but every single traffic light, every power line, every building has to be interconnected. And if you make one tiny error, the whole system fails.
Wow. So the design is like the blueprint,
Mm.
then you have the actual like fabrication, like making the chips.
Exactly. And that's where a company like TSMC comes in. They've mastered this technology called extreme ultraviolet lithography, EUV. It's like this super precise laser that etches these tiny circuits onto silicon so you can have these super powerful and efficient chips. That's why they're the top dog right now.
Okay, so they're making the majority of like the high-end chips.
Yeah.
But here's what I thought was interesting from the research you sent. A lot of that design work, that city planning you were talking about, happens somewhere else, like in the US. Why is that?
Yeah, the US still has a lot of expertise when it comes to chip design. It's highly specialized. You need massive teams of engineers, years of work. So TSMC might be like the manufacturing powerhouse. But a good chunk of the brains behind it are still coming from the US.
Interesting. So you have like design and manufacturing geographically separated, which brings us to Intel. They used to be the dominant force in all of this. But from what you sent over, it seems like they made a strategic misstep.
Yeah, for years, they were the king of the hill. They did it all, design, fabrication, the
That
whole nine yards. But they missed the boat on EUV, that laser technology I was talking about. TSMC invested heavily in it, and they were able to basically leapfrog Intel in terms of making this smaller, more powerful chips.
So that must have been a huge blow. Where do they fit in now?
Well, they're trying to get back in the game, investing a lot in new fabrication facilities here in the US,
Yeah.
trying to master EUV themselves. But here's where things get really interesting, and this is where Peter Zeihan's analysis comes in. He thinks that Intel might actually be in a better position for the future, despite that misstep.
Okay. Now I'm intrigued. Why would he say that?
Well, remember how we talked about the design being in one place and manufacturing in another? Intel still controls a lot more steps in the process compared to TSMC. They do design, fabrication, testing, packaging. It's called vertical integration.
So they're less reliant on like this global web of partners, more self-sufficient.
Precisely. And Zeihan argues that this is going to be crucial because we might be headed towards deglobalization.
Deglobalization. Whoa, okay. This is where things get kind of intense.
Think of it this way. The world's technology is like a giant puzzle. All the pieces are made in different countries, shipped around the world to be assembled. Deglobalization is like those countries start to hold on to their puzzle pieces, and it becomes much harder to build the complete picture.
So how does that relate to Intel and TSMC?
Well, if things become less global, more regional, having control over more of the process, having those processes closer to home, that becomes a huge advantage.
So Intel with their US-based facilities
Mhm.
and their model
They're less vulnerable to potential
to
disruption.
the supply chain.
Exactly. It's like they're building a fortress
Mm.
while everyone else is relying on these fragile bridges. But there's another layer to this, too.
Give it to me. What's the next one?
The concept of single point failures. It's not just that TSMC in Taiwan is the dominant manufacturer, it's that the whole semiconductor supply chain is full of these potential bottlenecks.
Okay, back up. Single point failures, bottlenecks. What are we talking about here?
Imagine a superhighway with only one bridge. If that bridge collapses, the whole highway shuts down. That's a single point failure in the semiconductor world. Those bridges could be anything. A company that provides a critical material, a specific location where a key manufacturing process happens.
So if there's a disruption at any one of these crucial points.
The whole system is affected.
Yeah.
And Zehan points out some really good examples. Like we rely heavily on South Africa for certain rare earth materials that are essential for chip production. What if something disrupts the mining operations there? Or silicon purification? A critical step in the process.
Yeah.
Heavily depends on facilities in North Carolina. Even the software used to design these intricate chips often comes from specific companies in San Jose.
It's like a giant web.
Yeah,
If you snip one thread in the wrong place.
the whole thing can unravel.
This is kind of unsettling.
It is, and it highlights why Intel's approach is so interesting. They might not be leading in cutting-edge manufacturing right now, but their control over more steps in the process, combined with their US-based fabrication facilities, makes them a lot less vulnerable to these single points of failure.
So while everyone else is hyper-specialized and spread out,
Yeah.
Intel has taken this
More
more,
approach.
like they're trying to create their own little ecosystem.
Exactly. A more localized, more controlled model. And as Zion argues, that might be the key to surviving and even thriving in a world where global trade and cooperation become less reliable.
This deglobalization scenario, it's a lot to wrap your head around. Like, we're so used to this interconnected world, it's hard to imagine things going the other direction.
It's definitely a shift in thinking, and it's not something that happens overnight.
Hmm.
But we're seeing the signs: rising geopolitical tensions, concerns about over-reliance on specific countries, a push for more regional self-sufficiency.
So in a way, Intel's kind of accidentally prepared themselves for this potential future. Like, they stumbled into a strategy that might be the most resilient in the long run.
There's definitely an element of that. It wasn't necessarily intentional, but their vertical integration and their focus on U.S. manufacturing now looks like a very smart move in light of these geopolitical shifts. But to be clear, TSMC is still a technological powerhouse. They're not just sitting around. And there are other players in the game too, like Samsung.
So it's not like Intel has a guaranteed win here. It's more like they've put themselves in a strong position to compete in a world where the rules of the game might be changing.
Exactly. It's a complex industry with a lot of unknowns, but understanding these forces at play, like deglobalization, and recognizing the different approaches these companies are taking, that's crucial for understanding where the industry might be heading.
Okay, so let's dive a little deeper into this deglobalization idea. Why is it such a big deal for semiconductors specifically?
Well, it's not just an abstract concept. It has very real consequences for how these chips are designed, manufactured, distributed. Remember those single-point failures we talked about? Imagine those pressure points becoming even more intense as countries prioritize their own interests and supply chains become more regionalized.
So we're not just talking about chips getting more expensive. We're talking about potential shortages, delays, maybe even the inability to produce certain types of technology if the necessary materials or expertise aren't available.
Precisely. It could stifle innovation, disrupt entire industries, even have geopolitical ramifications as countries compete for control over these crucial supply chains.
This is making me think about how interconnected everything is and how vulnerable we are to disruptions in these global networks. So let's play this out. If this deglobalization keeps going, what could we see happen in the semiconductor industry?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, and no one has a crystal ball. But we can look at some possibilities. One scenario is a shift towards more regionalized production. So instead of one dominant player like TSMC supplying most of the world, we might see multiple, more localized ecosystems emerge.
So instead of everyone sourcing materials and expertise from everywhere, you might have Intel focusing on North America, while other companies emerge to serve Europe or Asia.
Exactly. We might even see governments stepping in to support their own domestic semiconductor industries, offering incentives to build factories, research centers within their borders.
Okay.
This could lead to more competition, but also more redundancy in the system, which could be a good thing in terms of reducing those vulnerabilities.
So it's not necessarily a bleak picture. It's more like a reshuffling of the deck. It could even lead to a more diverse and resilient tech ecosystem.
That's one way to look at it. The key is how governments and companies adapt to this changing landscape. Do they embrace collaboration and open markets, or do they retreat into protectionism and self-sufficiency?
That's a big question, one that I'm sure is being debated all over the world right now. But here's what I'm taking away from all of this. The semiconductor industry is on the verge of a major transformation. And it's way more complicated than just who's making the fastest chips at this moment. It's about understanding those global networks, those single-point failures, and the strategic decisions companies are making to navigate a potentially less globalized world.
You've hit the nail on the head. It's a story that's still being written. And the choices made by governments and companies in the coming years are going to shape the technological landscape for decades to come.
Definitely food for thought. And speaking of food, All this talk about chips is making me hungry. Maybe we should grab some takeout after this. But seriously, this has been really eye-opening. It's fascinating, but also kind of overwhelming to think about how much is riding on these little chips. What does this all mean for someone like me? Or you listening right now? Like, it's one thing to understand the industry dynamics, but how does this potential shakeup actually impact our lives?
That's a great question. And the truth is, it impacts us in ways we don't even realize. I mean, semiconductors are the foundation of the digital world. They're in our smartphones, our cars, medical devices, even our refrigerators. If the supply of these chips becomes unstable because of deglobalization or any other factor, it could have a ripple effect across the entire economy.
So we're talking about more than just our laptops and phones getting more expensive. This could affect healthcare, transportation, food production. That's kind of scary.
It's definitely a possibility. Think about it. A shortage of chips could slow down the development of new medical technologies or disrupt the production of essential goods. And if certain countries gain a strategic advantage in semiconductor production, it could shift the balance of global power in ways we can't even predict right now.
Whoa, okay. Yeah, now I'm seeing the bigger picture. It's not just about tech companies competing. It's about national security, economic stability, access to essential goods and services. This is getting pretty deep.
It is, and it highlights why understanding this industry is so important. We often take these tiny chips for granted, but they're at the heart of so many aspects of our lives.
But it's not all doom and gloom, right? We talked earlier about how this shift could also create opportunities for innovation and competition. Can you talk more about that?
Absolutely. One potential upside to a more regionalized model is that it could lead to more specialized chips tailored to specific needs. For example, maybe Europe focuses on developing chips optimized for green energy solutions, while North America pushes the boundaries of AI and machine learning.
So instead of a one-size-fits-all approach, we might see more diversity and innovation as different regions play to their strengths.
Exactly. It could lead to a more vibrant and resilient tech ecosystem overall, but of course, this is all speculative. There are a lot of unknowns, and a lot will depend on the decisions made by governments and companies in the coming years.
Right. Well, you've definitely given me a lot to think about. I'm feeling a lot more informed about the semiconductor industry, but also more aware of how much is at stake and how much uncertainty lies ahead. Before we wrap up, I want to leave you, dear listener, with a question to ponder. We've talked about the potential for deglobalization and the challenges it poses. But what if those geopolitical tensions keep escalating? How far could this go? Could we see countries striving for complete self-sufficiency in chip manufacturing, effectively cutting themselves off from the global supply chain? Or will we see new forms of international cooperation emerge, perhaps with groups of allied nations forming their own secure semiconductor ecosystems? It's a complex issue with no easy answers, but it's something worth considering as we navigate this increasingly unpredictable world.
I think those are excellent questions, and ones that policymakers and industry leaders are grappling with right now. The future of the semiconductor industry, and indeed the future of technology itself, hinges on finding the right balance between national interests and global cooperation. It's a delicate dance, and one that will require careful and informed decision-making.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time for us to power down for today. But keep those mental circuits firing, folks. The world of semiconductors is anything but static. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep diving deep. Okay, so you've convinced me this is a big deal, but where do we go from here? Like, what can we actually do about any of this?
Well, that's the tough part. There's no easy answer. It's going to require a combination of things.
Yeah.
Government policies, industry initiatives, consumer awareness.
Okay, let's break that down. Let's start with the government. What role can they play?
Well, governments can provide incentives for companies to invest in domestic semiconductor production, tax breaks, subsidies, research funding, things like that. They can also invest in education and training programs to develop a skilled workforce for this industry.
Makes sense. So basically create an environment where companies are actually encouraged to build factories here.
Exactly. And not just rely on overseas production.
Okay, so that's the government. What about the industry itself?
Well, companies need to be proactive too. They need to diversify their supply chains, reduce their reliance on single suppliers, and explore new manufacturing technologies. Like maybe there are alternatives to EUV that are less geographically concentrated.
So kind of spreading the risk a little bit.
Yeah, and investing in innovation
Yeah.
to stay ahead of the curve.
And what about us, the consumers?
Well, consumers can support companies that are making these efforts. Buy products from companies that are investing in domestic production, and advocate for policies that support a more resilient semiconductor industry.
So like vote with our wallets, and make our voices heard.
Exactly. Every little bit helps.
This is a lot to take in, but it's also really empowering to know that we can actually do something about it.
I agree. It's not just about sitting back and watching the chips fall where they may. We can all play a role in shaping the future of this industry.
Well said. On that note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground today, from the technical intricacies of chip manufacturing to the geopolitical implications of deglobalization and the potential for both disruption and innovation in the semiconductor industry. I hope you found this conversation as informative and thought-provoking as I have, and that it's inspired you to learn more about this fascinating and crucial field. A huge thank you to our expert for sharing their insights with us today, and to you, dear listener, for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep questioning the world around you, because the future of technology, and indeed the future of our world, depends on engaged and informed citizens like you. Take care, and we'll see you on the next deep dive.